Hey everyone, Dr. Garcia here, and this is Chapter 1 Multicultural Psychology for Psych 4650. So let's just go ahead and dig right in. First thing, I want you to know that in this class, we will bring multicultural psychology to life. We're going to be talking about worldviews and how different groups communicate, immigration, acculturation, racism, identity, et cetera, et cetera. And so, really, this is going to help us not to just understanding multicultural psychology, but actually what it means to live in a diverse society and bring these stories to life. And that's what we're going to do because telling stories really enables us to be heard, to be recognized, and to be acknowledged by others. This is why part of your Genius Project is to go out, right, and talk to people and interview people and investigate and hear the stories of those in community. That's very important because we are going to bring multicultural psychology to life in this class. And so, but sometimes when we think about multiculturalism, we always talk about culture. And I want you to reflect on this question below. What does culture mean to you? Keep that in mind. Take notes on it. As you'll see these videos, you're going to see little moments and slides where I'm going to ask you to think about something or reflect on something or be prepared to discuss about stuff. And just make sure you do that. Pause, maybe take notes, and just reflect and consider what I might be asking you. All right. So, what is multicultural psychology? Well, first of all, psychology, as we know, is the systematic study of behavior, cognition, and affect. In other words, the ABCs. Affect, in other words, moods and emotions, behaviors, and cognition. Let's take a look at what break down the word multicultural. Multi is many, L, which is the ending, multicultural, all is pertaining to, and culture can be seen as either an external factor, which is influences of the events that occur around us in our interactions. And then culture can also be an internal factor, such as influences the way, and these internal factors influence the way that we process events and interpret different scenarios. Really, overall, when we just think of the word culture, right? Culture are the values, the beliefs, the practices of a group of people, right, who have a shared connection and a shared sense of belonging and membership. And what they share and what makes them connected and shared is these symbols, ideas, cultural traditions, belief systems, right, that are passed down from generation to generation. So when we think about multicultural psychology, we do have to think about sort of breaking down those terms and kind of get a good understanding of what that means. Multicultural psychology, in a nutshell, is the systematic study of the ABCs, affect, behavior, and cognition, in settings where people of different backgrounds are interacting. Okay, so really, what I would like for you to do here is we talked about these diverse experiences where people have these different multicultural backgrounds that are coming together, right? That's what multiculturalism, and we hope to have a multicultural society. But I would like for you to read about Vince, a Euro American student who's 30 years old, and he doesn't feel like he has much of a cultural identity. And I want you to think about that. Read his story and what it might feel like to not have a cultural identity. Some of you may feel like it resonates. His story may resonate with you. Other of you may feel like you don't understand that story. So go ahead and do that on your own. And so another thing I want to talk to you about is when we talk about culture, there are different things that are associated to culture. For example, there's culture of a city, right? Could be defined by the activities the city is known for, like good music or nightlife or, good foods, things of that nature. When we talk about teen culture, we talk about, I study that all the time, right? When we talk about teen culture, the culture of teens, like what is it that teenagers are engaged in? What is their language? What type of language or terms or words are being used? What are their favorite activities that they like to be involved in? So when someone asks you about your culture, how do you even reply? Is your culture a part of your identity? Think nationality, racial group, ancestral lineage. Again, another think about it slide, reflect on that. And when we're back in class, we'll chat about this again. So let's talk about the 6 uses of culture in everyday language. There's descriptive, right? Ways that we can talk about it, these specific behaviors that are associated with the culture, things like language, historical, a group's behaviors and activities that are associated with culture. This is very much like historical holidays. We have normative ways to talk about culture in our language, the rules that govern the behaviors of group. Gender roles is considered sort of normative features of culture. We have psychological which emphasizes behavioral processes such as learning and problem solving. For another way to talk about psychological tenet of culture is like the acculturation process. How much do people acculturate when they're in our society? Acculturation, in a nutshell, because we go over this specifically, distinctively later on in future chapters, but it really is how much of your culture of heritage are you going to maintain and adopt, and how much of the culture of the new society that you may in, if you've migrated here, are you going to maintain? That's the acculturation process. Then we have structural elements of structural culture, which is, reflects the organizational elements of culture, things like, when you have an extended family or you live in a multi-generational household. And then, of course, we have genetics. Genetic refers to the origins of your culture from a psychobiological approach. Okay, so when we talk about culture, we have a couple of ways to define it. I gave you a general description of what culture is, like, people who have come from the same group and membership and have a sense of belonging because they share the same values and beliefs and artifacts that have been transmitted from generation to generation. But we do have a couple of different ways to try to describe culture. There's a broad definition and a narrow definition. The broad definition is just like knowledge, concepts, rules, and practices, again, that are learned across generations. And I already mentioned that. But the narrow definition is the more specific artifacts and components that people engage with and they're part of their everyday lives. And sometimes you don't even think about it, like language, food, religion, family, music, customs, traditions, right? That's the narrow definition. The narrow definition is a little bit connected with what we call artifacts of culture. Artifacts of culture are typically either objects or, like in this case, language is an artifact of culture. Music is an artifact of culture. A cross is a symbol of religion and is an artifact of culture because it's highly valued with certain groups. Okay. So we have a broad and narrow definitions of culture. And this is another example of a very narrow definition of culture. So we have a community of deaf culture. And deaf culture is a social linguistic and cultural group that centers around the shared experiences of being deaf or hard of hearing. Now, people in deaf culture really take on a very narrow perspective of culture because those in deaf culture do believe that they should not be using American Sign Language, because by using American Sign Language to communicate, what you're doing is attempting to follow through with the expected norms in our general society, which means people of deaf culture, so that are deaf and hard of hearing, are adapting themselves to fit the normative patterns that are expected in society. So there are some folks in deaf culture who say, you know what, like, we shouldn't even have to learn ASL. We should learn our own systems of communication, not so that we can fit in with others. That deafness, it's okay to be deaf and not have ASL. There are other methods of communication and we don't have to use ASL. I mean, that's a very stringent perspective, but that is part of deaf culture as well. There are many, many groups over the last couple of decades, certainly throughout the 90s to present, who feel that ASL is a way that takes away from deaf culture because all it's doing is attempting to assign people with a way to meet the normative expectations of our society. So, which is your preference, broad or narrow? What are the benefits of the narrow definition? Are there any drawbacks? Again, think about it. I just put this into context for you on an example, but think about it and we'll have another chat in class. Now, the broader definitions of culture, or the broader definitions of culture, tend to include diversity and worldviews. And it's very important because it contributes to our understanding of what culture is, right? It really does understand culture with more depth when we have these broader definitions. So, of course, we have diversity, which is just acknowledging that individual difference go far beyond race and ethnicity and nationality. A lot of people, in like earlier on in our society, we would look at differences based on these phenotypic characteristics. In other words, the physical characteristics, and then place people into categories of race, ethnicity, nationality. More on that in a little bit later. But now when we think about sort of culture, we think of diversity and we think of age and sexual identity and religion and socioeconomic status, or even, excuse me, education levels, like all these different components that make a person who they are. What really helps us to understand sort of these tenets within the broad definition of culture is worldview. Worldview is very important here, right? Worldview is how we perceive our relationship to nature, institutions, organizations, people, and things. It really is a psychological orientation of our life. In other words, it's how we think, how we behave. It motivates us on the types of decisions we make and how we even define events. There have been very significant events that have occurred in the United States. Let me go back one slide. In the United States, and one of them was the O.J. Simpson trial, the Rodney King beatings, Philando Castile, who was killed by police officers after a routine stop. All of these things have really enforce these different ideas and different worldviews, right? So some people, for instance, believe that Rodney King was wrong and it was okay for him to be brutalized. And other people were like, that was not okay. And we want justice for Rodney King. So this is an example of worldviews that are very disparate. Not everybody has the same worldviews, which are unfortunately can complicate the way that we can get along with each other in a diverse society. Now, we have to understand that our worldviews are certainly shaped by past experiences and the historical context from where you come. And so we have to remember that in the United States, violence, fear, and intimidation were used during slavery. And that was because, people were fearful of those who were enslaved to maybe have an uprising. In some communities, there were more enslaved people than there were Euro Caucasians. And they were really worried about maybe having an uprising against them. So they used intimidation and violence and fear to maintain that, but it still exists, right? We still saw, the KKK came into fruition. We've had the neo-Nazi movement. Even now, would say we are in a newer movement as well in our current socio-political climate. And now it still exists within our justice system. So this history of violence, fear, and intimidation is something that historically shaped our world views, and unfortunately can have an impact on our diverse society and multiculturalism. So I want you to watch this video that's going to load up here. Don't watch it now, watch it on your own. And I want you to think about the type of worldview the police officers have as part of a subcultural group. So we're going to dig in a little bit into the Rodney King beatings and some of those outcomes. So after watching that video, hope you just finished watching it, you have to understand that the 4 police officers were charged with willfully and intentionally using unreasonable force. The trial was held in April of 1992, and there was 12 members of a predominantly white jury. All officers were found not guilty on all accounts. This is really important. Make sure you watch that video first before you dig into this. And thousands of people turned to violence and rioting for 6 days in response to that act. I lived in LA at that time. I was very young, but still, I lived just right outside of downtown LA, maybe about 4 to 5 miles away. And so I remember all of the fires and the burning and the violence that occurred at that time. So, what do you think was the worldview of the jury members, the worldview of the community? Why was this conflict in worldview so disparate? And I'll tell you a little bit of why there's so much disparity in the way that we see the world around us in a multicultural society is that most of the taxonomies that were placed in humans in early psychology, in early anthropologists, we started to look at categorizing humans and people based on these superficial characteristics. Again, these phenotypic characteristics like skin color, hair texture, size of a head, shape of the lips, right? And so then what happened was there became a hierarchical structure to all of life. And the idea was that Christian Europeans and European Americans were at the top. And they had lighter skin and lighter hair color and different smooth hair texture. And that was seen as being a privilege. And that was at the top, right? And everyone else was assigned to the lower chains where, really derogatory and demeaning language was used towards those individuals. These beliefs were so engraved in our society that they continue to be passed down from generation to generations, and they're still instilled in our society today. When we think about our justice system and our judicial system, there are plenty of stories, which we will talk about in class, where there is high rates of inequity, right, between different groups of people. So I want you to sit here after you watch your videos. You've heard this a bit. What do you think where the different worldviews, what happens when worldviews are in conflict. I think that's a good indication there. And another reflective question: what is your worldview on law enforcement? Has your perspective shifted? Because what we do know is that worldviews and perspectives can shift. So go ahead and read about Lucy, a 30-year-old Latina, and her story about how she grew up and how her worldview shifted over time. So perspectives can change, and we'll dig into that as well. In class, we're going to have another discussion, a final discussion, and chat about Claude Steele, who is a professor at Stanford University. We'll talk about worldviews and how worldviews actually start to shape his research and the evolution of stereotype threat, which we will talk about at length in this class as well. Okay, we're going to move on, but first, a quick quiz. Determined by physical and cultural characteristics of a group of people. What is the answer? So, of course, you can't take this quick quiz in the video, but you can go ahead and take it. Take it in the slides before you move on. So, pause the video here, take it, and then I'll see you on the next slide. Okay, if you didn't answer ethnicity, you're not alone, because culture, race, and ethnicity are the three most misunderstood and misused words in the English language. Okay, and so we will talk more about that when we get back into class. But we're going to detail the differences between culture, race, and ethnicity. So let's talk about race. So what is race? Well, there's a biological concept of race where there's a group of people who share a specific combination of these like phenotypic or physically, genetically inherited characteristics that distinguish them from other groups. Again, back to most of the taxonomies that were done earlier on to try to categorize people between psychologists and anthropologists, they use these superficial characteristics, skin color, hair texture, to create a hierarchical structure of those who are at the top and those who are not. And those that are at the bottom have systematically been marginalized and oppressed across generations and generations. We also have a sociocultural concept of race. These are characteristics, values, and behaviors that are associated with groups of people. Really, the social purpose for, and it has a social purpose, like it serves a social purpose for outsiders to view another group, or even a way for members of a group to perceive themselves. So we have a sociocultural concept of what race is. Originally, it was only biological in nature, looking at these phenotypic characteristics to categorize people based on who's at the top and who's at the bottom. Over time, race has now incorporated these sociocultural concepts to help us understand who we are from group to group. All right, so what about ethnicity? Well, ethnicity is determined by both physical and cultural characteristics. Thus, it's a combination of race and culture intertwined. So when you think about ethnicity, we kind of have to include race and culture. Now, I will say this, I'm going to pause here, because when we talk about race and the way that it was originally used in our society and how it was defined, we have to understand that race was a social construct. It was a term and it was a concept that was created by humans to make distinctive differences about other people and to validate the worth and value of some and to devalue life of others. So race is a construct. It's a social construct that was created to invite that. It doesn't really mean anything, doesn't really have meaning in the way that other terms do. It wasn't not genetics, right? It's not psychobiology, because it was this other complex kind of ways of allowing privilege and marginalization in our societies. So I have a problem with the idea of race and the definition of race, because the way that it was constructed and the manner by which it was meaningful. Sometimes when it says, what is your race? I click prefer not to ask, because I don't want to validate the notion of using race, which has this context of, again, those with and those without. So ethnicity, though, is determined by physical and cultural characteristics, and it sometimes is intertwined with race and culture. So when we talk about ethnic identity, we also have to talk about intersectionality. These are just meaningful ways in which various social statuses can interact with each other, things like social class, gender, race, biological sex, and results in differing experiences with oppression and privilege. Intersectionality is a theory about how multiple forms of discrimination can overlap, particularly if a person has multiple minority statuses. So if you're an ethnic minority, a gender minority, a sexual identity minority, ability minority, all of those come together. And this is how racism, sexism, and even classism can affect marginalized groups. So, we've already talked about what culture is. It's the knowledge, concepts, rules, and practices that are learned and transmitted across cultures. So, now we have a better definitions the difference of race versus ethnicity versus what culture is. And I think there's just a couple of visuals here. A piñata is very typical within Mexican culture. Within Black community, there's hair culture. When you do your hair, how you do your hair, the products you use for your hair, how long it takes to do your hair, all of these things are part of your culture, right? These are the narrow definitions of culture. When it comes to cultural contact is very important, right? So there is something called the contact hypothesis, and that is the more you come into contact with people who do not look like you, talk like you, like have the same features as you do, right? Because they're not part of your group membership, so to speak, then the more we will have acceptance and a real true multicultural and diverse society without factions and differences. Well, there'll be differences, but they won't be factions and division, I should say. So, people for cultural contact is people from different cultural, ethnic, or linguistic backgrounds that come into social contact with each other, which is a good thing. The more contact you have, the less divisiveness you have. There are two broad categories of contacts. Number one, contacts between members of a culturally diverse society who just happen to come in contact with each other and are from many, many different backgrounds because they live and work in the same places. And then two, cultural contact can take place when people visit one society to another or another country, like for business or tourism or to go study. All right, so here's another quick quiz again. Now it's time for you to take this quick quiz again. Now that you know a little bit more about culture, race, ethnicity, and intersectionality, hopefully this question is a lot easier for you to answer. And these are the different definitions of how we study culture in psychology. So we keep talking about culture, but really we have ethnic minority psychology, the study of issues that are relevant to racial and ethnic groups that have historically been marginalized or oppressed. Cultural psychology is the study of how unique practices within a culture shape one's behavior, cognition, and affect. And then, of course, we have cross cultural psychology, which is really the search for these universal principles of human behavior, cognition, and affect. In other words, in what ways are we common? What are the commonalities across different cultures? So these are the different ways that we can study culture in psychology: ethnic minority psychology, cultural psychology, or cross cultural psychology. And with that, I'm going to pause here. We will pick up with multiculturalism as a philosophy. So I want to thank you very much for watching. I will see you back in class and be ready to chat. Bye, everyone.